Jackson, I have I guess, like a bone to pick with you,
Okay.
which is, as you know, when you apply to start a YouTube channel
hmm
at YouTube
There's a
Industries,
there's a very big it's a very competitive
it's
industry.
a very elite, exclusive kind of thing. And
Yes,
as you know, when you fill out that application, you made a very solemn commitment to only talk about television on your channel.
I did.
So you can imagine my shock and surprise when you put out, I think, the longest video you've ever made
Definitely
is
the longest thing I've ever made.
a
Absolutely.
56-minute video about the MCU as a part of your propaganda series. So my question
Hmm.
is, what do you have to say for yourself?
I mean, I don't see where is the lie. Where I think the MCU is a TV series, or at least I think that the lines are blurry enough that it is a discussion worth having. Um,
So what I'm hearing is you think that Martin Scorsese has some great points.
I think he does have some great points, and you know, I know that in this chat, I'm not the only person who thinks so. I
Yeah.
believe there's a video on your channel called Martin Scorsese is Right about Marvel movies. Um, yeah, I think so. I made my channel and I said, I'm only doing TV because, I don't know. I was doing TV and then I like leaned into it because I was like, I like TV and then I wanted to do a video about the MCU, and it started as like a bit, but now I'm pretty like convinced that it's a TV series, or
Yeah.
at least I don't know. Everything is changing with all the streaming services and everything else. I think it's just as I don't know. It's pretty TVE, and I think that Scorsese's got a lot of points. I think this is kind of what he was talking about when he went off about it not being cinema, and he called it like amusement parks, and that's one way to go. But I think what he's really complaining about is that it feels like TV to him, which is like a lesser medium to
Yeah.
the great Scorsese.
I mean, I don't to be fair, I don't think he even necessarily thinks that like television is a lesser medium. He just mostly thinks it's not specifically like cinema, but we don't have to
Yes.
get into those weeds. Um
Did
yeah,
he
no,
did
I'm
did he do vinyl? Was that him?
he did vinyl, he did uh produced, I think he maybe directed an episode of what was that? Terrence Winter, is that his name?
Yeah.
Steve Buscemi crime
Boardwalk
Boardwalk
Empire.
Empire. Yes, yes. He did like a couple episodes of that, and then he did the Netflix show documentary series, I guess maybe about Fran Lebowitz. Um, and I think there's one other thing. I just
Was
tallied these up literally yesterday because I'm writing a follow up to the Martin Scorsese video. Um, so I was like tallying up everything he's
okay.
done that's not cinema.
Okay.
Um,
Yes.
but yeah, he's done some TV, and he's talked about that, and he says like, you know, he doesn't look down on TV necessarily, at least that he says, and he just sees it as a different medium.
It's
Um,
interesting because I think so many TV creators, maybe less now, but like certainly in the 2000s, in like the aughts, were just like they all just like wanted to not be making TV. Like they just
right.
wanted to
Yes.
pretend they were. There's like a there's like some there's some quote from like David Chase who wrote The Sopranos, and he's like, I could have been spending all this time making movies, and Alan Ball, who's the creator of Six Feet Under, like I guess responded to that quote, and he was like, "What movies were you gonna make?"
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's absolutely. Wait. Okay. Hold on. Sorry.
No
I am
worries.
recording on there. I thought I was recording on Zoom, but I wasn't.
You're double
My
record.
backup recording was in there though, so we should be good.
We needed that last time, so
Yeah, we did.
that's
It's a good thing I do both. Sorry, where were we?
Scorsese cinema.
Scorsese, cinema, TV. Yeah, no, I definitely think there are some people who like see it that way. It's like film is the high art and television is, you know, for the masses or something. Um, and I don't know that that was ever necessary. Well, I don't know that that was ever necessarily true, but if it was at some point, it definitely isn't now. Like
Yeah.
like there was a time I would this is what I would say. It like I think there was a time where the format of how television was displayed constrained it in such a way that made it difficult to really go deeply into topics in a way that um, lends itself to like a deeper, more artistic effect, if I have to use that word,
I mean, it's more
exploration of
commercial,
things.
right?
Right. Yes.
Its history is literally a device for delivering advertisements.
Yeah, it's broken up. You had to keep people's attention. You had to keep them from not changing the channel, and all of
Exactly.
those.
Yeah.
Neil Postman talks about this stuff. Like all of that influences how the content is made for that medium, and then, you know, I think because of those influences to some extent, it ended up being like generally a more surface level, like exploration of things than film was in like a certain time period. And I'm talking like, you know,
You're talking
maybe
like the 60s,
yes,
70s.
60s, 70s, and that's the time that kind of Scorsese sees as like the heyday of film. It's like, you know,
It's also probably the
Fellini,
last time
like
he watched TV, so.
right. um
I don't really see Scorsese as like a guy who's like binging The Americans.
well, yeah, and this is the point. Essentially, I'll give you like a rough draft of I won't do the full thing, but this is essentially what I want to look at in my video revisiting this topic is like he's seeing from his perspective, he's seeing the death of something, and it's very sad to him. It's like he paints this. He wrote. I don't know if you saw. He wrote this Harper's essay that was kind of a follow up to stuff
I
he
haven't
said
seen
about
that. No.
Marvel a while back, and he talks more about the like cinema definition and its death, but he also in that talks about like Netflix and kind of the treatment of things online as pieces of content, like how everything just becomes like content. And so he talks a little bit about that. But anyway, in that, he paints this very vivid picture of like walking on the streets of New York in the 70s and like the excitement of like seeing on the marquee, it's like Fellini's 8.5, and you go in and it's like, it's very exciting
It's
and
like going to the theater, right?
right. It's this process of going to the theater and everything was very fresh and new and the medium was developing in like an exciting way and it was like the forefront of like art and culture were kind of working. And I completely acknowledge that that was probably a very exciting time, especially for someone who was as into cinema as he was, and that that is going away to some degree. It's not like that.
Yeah.
You don't walk down the street and be like, "Oh, there's this crazy groundbreaking film like in theaters that you just wander into." But what he's probably not experiencing that like we're experiencing as we I don't know how old he was when 8.5 came out, but he's probably like we're probably a similar age now that he was then. And what he's probably not experiencing is like the excitement I feel watching like Fleabag or
Yeah.
like Atlanta or seeing like this cutting edge of like the medium of television progressing and like pushing the boundaries of what it is and these artists who are using it in really unique, interesting ways. And so it's like, yes, maybe cinema is dying, but maybe if that's what we have to sacrifice in order to gain
But yeah,
Fleabag.
I mean, that's a
then-
question that is probably too big of a question for us to answer,
Oh, sure,
especially
yeah.
having not experienced that. Like, is it worth losing this thing that we never really experienced to have this
Right.
thing that we did experience?
Yeah,
You and
yeah,
I
yeah.
may say like, yeah, sure, but Scorsese might say no. But I think what you're getting at is like the blending, and to bring it back to the MCU, is the blending
Yes.
of television and film. And Fleabag is a great example of this. And I think that like Fleabag started as a one-woman show. Then it became a limited series that was 6 episodes. And I think that the episode structure of it really works well. I've written about it and stuff, and I think that each episode like takes a different like angle on this character, and I think that that's something that film really struggles to do in terms of like shifting perspectives. And then it became a second season that was even better than the first season. That was like 3 years later. and was also, and you're seeing like all of these limited series are really challenging this idea of uh, film versus TV. Like, is Chernobyl really a TV show?
Yeah.
Or is it a film? Or is it kind of like a mix of the two? And, stuff like that. And this is why I think if you like look at it on paper, I think it's really hard to argue that the MCU isn't a TV series because it's got this huge cast of characters. It has a bunch of different episodes that all stand alone but are part of a larger narrative. It is literally broken into seasons. There's phase one, phase two, phase three. I mean, season one, season two, season three, where there's a big bad at the end of each one that they like build up to and they defeat. Yeah, I struggle to see how it's not a TV series. But and like the guy who is the architect of the whole thing is Kevin Feige. He's like this one creative vision over the whole thing, and that's the same thing as like a David Chase or
Yeah.
any one of these other like executive producers that's a mastermind of the whole thing. And you bring on these different directors, and all of these films are shot or like edited in like previs before the directors even get there because they're all supposed to look basically the same, which is totally a TV thing and something that a lot of directors have not liked about TV. And we can talk about that if you want. But I think you're just like seeing a lot of these. It just feels very TV to me, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. Obviously, I love TV, but the only thing that is really movie about it is that it costs a ton of money, and they show it in a movie theater, and that's their distribution model.
Yeah.
Which is probably disappearing now that Disney Plus is taking off, and there's the pandemic, and everything else.
Yeah, no, I think there's a great argument to be made for that. I can't really disagree that strongly. It's like, especially when you take into consideration how big, how simultaneously, as sort of these big franchises, series of films have become more like TV, how simultaneously a lot of TV became more like these films. And you already mentioned like limited series, things like Chernobyl, which it does in a lot of ways. It's much closer to what a film is than it is to like what Seinfeld is. Like there's
Yeah,
more
absolutely.
similarities, or things that we would think of as would have been traditionally TV for like the
Or
last
like Law and
50
Order,
years.
right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, but a great example of that is something like Game of Thrones, where it's like it was these huge, like big budget, like
Yeah,
experiences that people were even like gathering together to watch socially to really simulate essentially like
a
a
theater going experience.
cinema
Yeah,
theater experience. It's like I think there was even maybe some places where like people rented out theaters and they showed
yeah, I
episodes of
bet.
it in theaters for like the premiere or whatever.
They usually
So,
do that for a lot of TV shows, for what it's worth. But
oh, okay.
I don't know if
Nice.
that was always a thing. If that's more of a recent thing that is kind of pointing to this. I wouldn't say that. Like, I think you're right that TV is becoming more like film, and film is becoming more like TV, and they're kind of meeting in the middle. I don't think that TV is like devolving into
Right.
TV or
Yes.
whatever, and film is evolving into cinematic is this word that gets thrown around all the time about TV. It'll be like, oh, it's just such a cinematic TV show. And like the implication there is that that's better. Like
Right.
it looks
Yes.
better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you brought up Game of Thrones, and like, what is the difference between Game of Thrones and the MCU, really?
Right. No. Yeah. There's a few more episodes. There's more episodes in Game of Thrones, basically,
Right.
and uh, and it's not shown in a theater. That's like the material. That's the biggest material
I would say
difference.
the one structural difference is that they'll touch on storylines a lot more frequently. Like
Right.
each episode in the MCU is like one story, and then they kind of like overlap, and then they like piece
Yeah.
them together, and it becomes this other thing. But I don't know if you've seen like Mrs. America, which was just on FX on Hulu.
I've seen some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the same thing. They're
Yeah.
telling the story of the Equal Rights Amendment from and it like follows a different character in each one, and they'll overlap with other characters, but
Yeah.
for the most part, it's like, what was this person's story? Okay, what was this person's story? And I don't know, like, what's the difference between that and like Thor Ragnarok, then Black Panther, then Infinity War or whatever?
Yeah. And it's all like, and it's all being propelled, especially by like the last year, things
Yeah.
moving to streaming. I mean, have you seen did you actually watch the Snyder Cut?
Okay, so no, I have not sat down and watched the Snyder Cut
Fair
because
enough.
it's it's long. uh, but yeah,
I wouldn't have watched it. I don't think I've admitted this anywhere online, so maybe I will here, so
Ooh,
that
we
there's
got the scoop.
some tea for the people who bother to watch this. But like so I hadn't even seen the Justice League until the night before the Snyder Cut dropped. I only watched it because I was like interested in comparing the two, and have never seen, still haven't, Batman versus Superman,
I saw that
Aquaman,
on a plane. Batman v Superman.
either Wonder Woman movie.
Also plane.
So like literally the last DC comic film I watched was Man of Steel. So I went Man of Steel, Justice League 2017, the Snyder Cut. So maybe that takes all my credibility away from anyone who watched that
Or
video.
maybe it gives you more credibility.
But yeah, it probably gives me more credibility.
Because you're not so in the weeds. And
Yes.
I think that this is I think what we're actually talking something you said just now about the tea reminds me of one of the I think what the biggest similarity between TV and the MCU and also the DC is trying to do this. They're just I think they're not quite as successful.
Failing.
Yeah. And maybe they should abandon it and try to be more cinematic or like more filmy about it and worry less about like this extended universe. But there are so many winks and nods to the audience that is like you're paying attention. You've
Yes.
seen all of the episodes.
Yes.
If you're coming in blind, you can still enjoy this. But it's nice to know it's like an I mean they're Easter eggs. That's what they're called. Yeah. And this is like a idea that was pioneered on at least in like a visual audio visual medium on like cult TV shows that couldn't get huge audiences, so they had to make sure that they kept the audience they had. And the best way to do that was to just like keep winking to them, keep acknowledging them, keep
Yes.
rewarding them for paying close attention. You see this on like Buffy or like Battlestar Galactica in the 2000s or stuff like that. Or Lost is a great example. Although Lost was super successful at first. And we don't have to get into Lost, but yeah, I think that this is like comic books have been doing this for a while too, is like they're not really interested as an industry in growth as much as they are just like keeping who they have.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that that's like a defining characteristic of the MCU and one that makes it very television-esque.
No, yeah, you're making an excellent point that like how you're supposed to engage with these big franchise series, whether it's the DC films or the MCU, it is the same as how people generally like you're supposed to watch all the episodes. It's not just like dip in. You can more so than like a lot of modern television shows where it's like a continuous narrative. But
which is a problem I have with a lot of TV shows nowadays. I think things are getting like a little too serial.
Right. Yeah.
Which is why a bunch of people like The Mandalorian, but because it's like less serial.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But like that's a very but like it rewards engaging with the material in that way. And they like, I've seen all these, I know the characters, I know the Easter. Yeah, I get the references.
Did you feel like the Snyder Cut had a lot of those when you were watching? Did you feel like I don't get what they're talking? Like, there's something here that I'm not getting because I wasn't like in the loop. Because I definitely felt that way when I watched Endgame for the first time, and I hadn't seen Winter Soldier or whatever else in the flow of whatever. And they're like nodding to all these old. I mean, that movie is especially like. That's like a series finale. Like it does the same thing that like The Good Place does at the end, where it's like, here are all the great moments that we've had over the last 3 seasons.
Yeah.
And And I was like, I don't remember that, so
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not getting anywhere. Did you feel that way with the Snyder Cut too?
Less than with Endgame because I had the same experience that you did with Endgame. I watched it and I hadn't seen like several of the other films prior. Um, but yeah, it was definitely less that way with the Snyder Cut, where there would be like a character would pop up and I would be like, is this character being introduced or should I already know who they are? Like, and I would be a little confused. But like the actual plot, it's it's like, oh, you get spoilers here. You get Superman is dead.
Yeah.
I guess that's spoilers not for the Snyder Cut. That's spoilers for the other one.
Superman or Batman v Superman. The
But
Dawn
like
of Justice.
it's pretty easy to like pick up on the broad strokes of like what's going on. I never felt like confused about the plot or what they were trying to do or but I'm sure there was some stuff that I was
Yeah.
missing, but definitely less explicitly than like Endgame, where in Endgame there was definitely stuff where I'm like, I can tell that's supposed to be like a moment for people who have seen all these, and I
Yeah.
don't get it. There wasn't really that.
Or if I could just, I'm just like kind of riffing here. I'm not riffing, but I'm kind of just like rambling. I realize that there's like, I'm losing the structure to this argument. But another thing that makes MCU like TV is that it's so powered by these like, oh, it's that guy. That guy's back. Like
Yes.
it'll be like a character will pop up and you're like, and the flow of the movie will kind of stop because it's meant to be watched in this theater. And if you saw Endgame in the theater, every time one of those characters popped up, there people would just start clapping. They're like rooting along, and it's that kind of pause is like built in. So your relationship with these characters that are not in the film up to that point is part of the experience of watching this thing. And I feel like you have that experience more than I feel like it's important to point out that this is not like an all movie franchises thing.
Right.
Certainly, like,
but it's like DC, MCU, the Star Wars has kind of
is
been
another
this
one like that.
recently.
But like Fast and Furious is not like that.
Fast and Furious is not like that. I don't like the Bond films aren't really like that. There's a lot of those.
I guess there was a little bit with that in Fast and Furious because I haven't seen a lot of the Fast and Furious movies, but I know people were excited when like Han showed up or something.
There's kind of moments, I guess, in like Bond. It's more like you'll get certain tropes where it's like, oh, this here's the gadget for this, or like same thing in the Mission Impossible ones. There's like a million of those now.
Or when James Bond says like the lines,
right? Yes,
recurring.
Yeah. But I take your point that like not every franchise film is structured like this to the extent that
the MCU
is. And look, what you're describing there though about like a character showing up and like basically people clapping in the audience, like that's literally that moment is built into sitcoms where like a character will show up, the studio audience will clap, and then it moves on. And yeah, that's a very television type of thing.
And it was like really obvious when you watched WandaVision, and like that's literally a joke that they put in about the Quicksilver, right? And if you hadn't seen all of the movies that Wanda was in the MCU and hadn't seen the X-Men movies that this actor was in, you weren't going to have that reaction. They were like relying on you having done all of that homework. And obviously WandaVision is like actually a quote unquote TV show, but they're all kind of the same thing in my opinion.
Just to touch on something related to the Snyder Cut, it's also the Snyder Cut specifically, I feel like was built to be viewed at home. Like because it's 4 hours long, I feel like there's probably very few people who sat down and like actually watched that thing all the way through. Like I watched it in chunks. Like I think probably almost everybody, like there was literally like chapter markers in HBO Max on the thing. It's like part 1, part 2. So
like there was very YouTube essay.
Yeah. There was very clear like points where you could pause and take a break, and so that's also an element where as streaming and all these things converge, it's like I don't know. The Snyder Cut.
Scorsese would be against that or for that? the chapter markers.
I don't know about the chapter markers. I know he very specifically was like against when there were people who were like The Irishman, because The Irishman was also almost 4 hours long.
Right.
There's people who were like The Irishman should be a miniseries, and he was like, no, it's not, for I guess reasons. Um,
I mean,
but
it makes
so
sense to
I
me,
think he'd
but
kind of be against that. But so speaking of Scorsese, I think something that's interesting. One of the things I think that's interesting about this discussion, the one we're having about like is the MCU a television show, and also that overlaps with him saying those things aren't cinema, is like it's less about, I feel like in both cases it's really less about is it or isn't it, and more about like the words that we have to define these characters, these categories are starting to fail. Like um they're not really the best
yeah,
way to describe things anymore. It's like there's video content, and we need new terms for like the type of genre of content that it is. Like
absolutely.
is it a grand narrative spread across like hours of content and meant to be engaged with in a certain way, and that's a certain type of thing, and that includes Game of Thrones, the MCU, some other
Star Wars,
television shows, Star Wars, some of these other things. And then there's like something like
the Grey's Anatomy
Fleabag,
universe.
or yeah, there's like tradition, and then there's like traditional television that doesn't really exist in any form in theaters. Um,
Mm.
and then there's like also this overlap between like Fleabag, which is basically like a movie. It's like written by one person. It's very
It's
almost
shorter than a lot of movies.
auteuristic in its approach, and it's just split up into little chunks. And then and that overlaps with like an art film, and that's a different, or I don't know, for lack of a better word,
Yeah,
and that's kind of a different category. And it's like maybe we just need new terms, but unfortunately there's not like a name committee that we can commission to just.
I think you touched on this earlier when you were talking about uh, you were talking about Neil Postman, but I was thinking about Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message, right?
Right, yeah,
And the main difference between television and film was the distribution at first, right? You go to a theater, you sit down, you give a film all of your attention, whatever. And television is an ad delivery service,
yeah,
basically, like make your ads more entertaining, whatever. I guess there's like news too, but we're talking about like scripted stuff.
yeah,
And now that we are kind of, you can stream stuff, you have all of these subscription services that there are no ads in them, and all these other things. You're starting to see the breakdown of those, of like why those things were different, and it's because
yeah,
of that delivery system,
yeah,
because of that medium. And as those boundaries are being pushed, you're seeing the definitions kind of falter, because we kind of built all of these definitions on top of that structure. And since that structure is changing, we're like, oh, well, it's not a TV series because it's long. It's like, but TV series are super long, like all the time.
yeah,
And or like episodes are long. Like some of the episodes of Game of Thrones were like 90 minutes long.
yeah.
And yeah, I get crap from my friends all the time. They're always like, The Sopranos is like one long movie. I'm like, it's not
It's
a
really
movie.
not. No, not really. um yeah, I think it's, and also it's like discussing things like, you know it's difficult to kind of describe in this space, like you making your case for why uh the MCU is like a television show. It's like you have some good arguments, but it kind of just comes down to like it feels like a television show.
Yeah,
And that's basically also what Scorsese is doing. Like there was this really interesting, I forget where it was, some interview I saw with him where like somebody was asking him if Joker was cinema. And Joker,
trolling him.
I don't know. He gave it a serious answer, so I guess.
Okay, cool.
But like Joker's an interesting case because it doesn't have a lot of the features
Yeah.
of like what he's calling not cinema has. Like it's not these huge action. It's not a theme park ride. Like
Yep.
that's a bad description for Joker. So
It
it's not
doesn't.
a
It doesn't really fit into a larger narrative.
right.
I mean, it does,
Well,
but like, kind of just like almost like a token way. Like you mentioned this in your video about Justice League and the Snyder Cut, and you were like, "Oh, there's this thing about, there's the Joker in it. There's some people are very
right.
happy that
Yeah.
he's in it, but like it's kind of not really part of the movie. Like it's not like
Yes.
built into the DNA of the movie."
Yeah. Yeah.
And the same
That
thing is in Joker with like Batman dying or parents
right,
dying.
right. We even like the fact that, and this was, I guess, ultimately like Scorsese's answer to that question was he was kind of like, it's not cinema basically on a technicality, which was he was like, the fact that Joker is Joker and Batman's in the movie is kind of just this like incidental to
Yeah,
the
this
broader.
could have been about anything, right? Like it didn't have to be that
Yeah.
IP grafted on top of it.
Yes, yeah, and that grafting of the IP to Scorsese, and I'm not saying he's right about this, but the grafting of the IP for him, for some reason, is like integral to the definition of cinema, which I think is interesting, not necessarily because he's right, but because it speaks to something we were talking about earlier, which is that like the way you engage with it is different. It's like, and so I think
Yeah,
for him, it's like, oh, this isn't like this isn't cinema or whatever that is, a movie where you like sit down and you get this contained experience, and it's something that like is supposed to be a part of a broader experience where a good bit of what is interesting about it is the fact that it's Joker, and that's like
right.
external to the thing it's in and of itself.
And I think that in that case, he's totally right about the like death of cinema. Like you're seeing, and I don't know, a bunch of other directors have talked about this too. And I've listened to like Sam Esmail, who created Mr. Robot and
Yes, yeah,
Homecoming. He's talked about this. Is one of the reasons he's on TV now is because he felt like all of the young, exciting directors were getting pigeonholed or like put into this like in industry, this like complex. I was gonna say movie industrial complex, but like that doesn't make any sense. But like this machinery of okay, Ryan Coogler is this really interesting up and coming director who did Fruitvale Station. Let's throw him into doing IP stuff that's like Rocky and Black Panther.
yes,
And
yeah,
like if Tarantino was coming up now, would they be throwing him on like the new Suicide Squad or something? And the answer is probably like yes. And
have you seen Nomadland?
I have not.
So I watched Nomadland, which is like this really, I mean, it's Oscar
I
nominated.
know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Chloe Zhao,
Whose next movie is The Eternals.
yes, and I was like, oh, this was a very interesting movie. I liked Nomadland, but more so, I was like, more than I liked Nomadland, I liked her direction of the film, and so I was like, I'm very excited to see what she does next. So I looked it up, and I was like, oh. I mean,
But
like
isn't it sort of-
more power to her.
Yeah.
Like I would take the money in that circumstance, probably. Like, but
It seems like a
still,
really
it's
easy
just
gig
like,
for a director, again, because they've already cut the entire thing in previs.
yes, yeah. She said, quote, it's going to be a risk for Disney. So I love hearing that. I love.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we don't have to get into this, but I like looked at, I don't know anything about it, but like the cast and like the general concept seems so weird to me that, yeah, it seems like a risk, but I think they're at the point where there are no risks for Disney.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We're going back to our stream theory roots. I think that they have the whole like MC, people are just buying into that. They don't need any, which is exciting, I guess, if they can like take that and run with, like, I thought that was interesting with a lot of WandaVision. People were like buying into this thing and they got like really experimental with like the structure of television for like 6 episodes, and then it became an MCU thing again, which maybe is like the destiny of all of these things, is that it can be interesting, but it has to tie into this IP
To
in
be,
some way, shape, or form.
I think like, and this is something that I think makes the discussion about like the death, that's it's not really what we're talking about mainly here, but the discussion about the death of cinema I think gets really complicated because of that, where it's like, is cinema really dying, or is like it just not the is it just not the main thing? And the main thing are these huge big budget, like you'll just, though, like actually little interesting films, or these like really inventive little TV shows are just maybe never going to have the massive commercials, are never going to have the massive commercial success of like
Mhm.
these entities that are produced by these huge media companies and have existing fan bases and like IPs tied into it. And
Here's
but
my counterpoint, real quick. My
go
counterpoint is
go
Stranger Things. Like
right.
that is not a
But
thing that existed with pre-existing IP. It is calling back to like a lot of nostalgia and stuff like that.
yes,
But
yes,
like if we're looking for something, if we're looking for like the golden age of cinema where, directors are creating these like original works that are then being turned into all the IP that we're talking about,
right,
like Spielberg does E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and those both become like these franchises, or Star
yeah,
Wars,
yeah.
or whatever else. Um, I think that like Stranger Things, or I guess that was just like the first one that came to
That's
mind.
no, that's a good counterpoint, and I think there's always going to be like exceptions.
But that was like a
Um,
small thing. Like nobody thought that that was going to blow up, and then it
right,
just did
yes,
because
it was
Netflix
huge.
is. I mean, that was like the first big like Netflix made this thing.
And Tiger King, we have the Tiger King cinematic universe to look forward to.
I know it's like
um,
been done to death, but it is wild to me that Tiger King was as big as it did and flamed out as fast as it
fast
did.
as it did, yeah. I did know. I just, uh, yeah. There's some people who are still catching up on it though. Like every now and then I'll hear somebody mention it. I'll be like, "You're really a little behind on that one, aren't you?"
They're like, yeah, I decided to check out this thing. It's
They're
called
like,
Tiger King.
it's really crazy. And we're like, yes, we all
Yeah, yeah, we all
realized
did
that a
this
year ago.
already. That's one of those things where the entire allure is being able to like bond with people over how crazy it is. But if
Yeah,
people aren't going through the experience at the same time, it really doesn't have any legs whatsoever. Um, like it's not like it's not that interesting of a story, like a narrative.
yeah, yeah.
There aren't like any twists and turns. It's kind of just like, wow, this is just these people are out there. They're just bonkers.
You're watching this thing, and what's crucial to the experience is that moment when you can like look at somebody else and go like, are you seeing
Text
what
them,
I'm
yeah.
seeing? It's like, yeah. So,
It
uh,
reminds me of this little documentary that's on Vimeo. It's called American Juggalo, and they just go to one of the gathering of the Juggalo. Do you know what the Juggalos are?
yes, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Sometimes people don't know, and I'm like, you're missing out, man. But they go to like one of the dark carnivals of the gathering of the Juggalos, and they just like walk around and interview everybody. And the whole thing is just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
who what like there's no plot to it. It's just a
Right,
bunch of
yes.
clips of like them interviewing all these people, and like Tiger King's like the same thing, but a big cat
Yeah, yeah.
and like a little more in depth.
All you have to sometimes all the documentarian needs to do all sometimes all the documentarian needs is access. Like they just
Yeah,
need to shine a light. It's like this that's a weird like, there's so many times where I watch a documentary and I'm like, that was not a good documentary, but it was amazing because like just the subject matter was so good. Like all you had to do was turn on a
that's like what
camera.
Tiger King is, right?
Yeah, it's like it wasn't that. If you're actually evaluating it as like, was this documentary like really well made? It's like, oh, okay, whatever. It's fine.
Or
But
like
like,
what does it really like have to say, or
yes,
whatever
yeah.
else? Yeah.
But like the subject matter is just so like, yeah. It's,
Is
it's like a movie that has a great script, but like isn't that well produced. It's like the story was interesting, but
is Chloe Zhao an American director?
I don't know if she's. I don't think
Is she
so.
like no? She's from China. Okay,
Yeah,
she's Chinese, or she was born in Beijing at least.
yeah. I
Because I
knew
was
she was
thinking,
Chinese. I just didn't know if she was like.
yeah, but like if she was Chinese American, or
Yeah,
because I was thinking that you're seeing. I was when we were talking about that, I was like, who are some of the other up and coming directors who would get like funneled into this? And for some reason, I
right,
was like Bong Joon Ho, but he would like never get funneled into that because he's like the biggest director in Korea, right?
right. Yeah,
And he does these other things. Although he is doing like the Parasite extended universe on HBO, so maybe my point is like
yes.
is moot. But like and I was thinking like Alfonso Cuarón is not really doing that. Although he did do Prisoner
He
of
did
Azkaban.
he got that Harry Potter dip. So
Although I will say like that one feels super different than all the other Harry Potter movies.
yes, yeah. It's not always like it's not always a train wreck. Uh, what's his
Hmm.
name? The guy, I think Garrett Edwards. Is that
He
his
did
name?
Star Wars, right?
Yes.
Or he did
So
Rogue One, right?
he did like one indie movie, and then it was like a found footage superhero type thing, and then he did.
Oh, you're thinking of Colin Trevorrow.
Oh,
No, no, no,
I'm
no.
I'm
Hold
mixing
on.
them two up. Yeah. Who?
You're thinking of the movie Chronicle, which was directed by Josh Trank, who then got brought
No,
on to
yeah.
do.
Josh Trank is garbage.
He got on
That
to do the Fantastic Four, which
yes,
went poorly.
yes. Um,
But yeah, he's part of that
no,
same
no.
like.
I was mixing them
Yeah.
up, but Garrett Edwards is also an example of that. I forget what he did first, but he did
Monsters.
Monsters. Yes, okay, that's it. I haven't seen Monsters, but he did Monsters, and then he got to do Godzilla, and he got to do Star Wars right after that. And I genuinely think his direct like that Godzilla he did and Rogue One aren't like the best movies, but I genuinely think he brought something interesting to both of those as a director.
Yeah.
So like from that perspective, what the studios play to be like, oh, let's find this guy and he'll bring something interesting to the project, I think paid off. It didn't make like incredible movies necessarily, but I
But I
think
think
they
this
achieved.
is what Sam Esmail and Scorsese are getting at when they're talking about like the death of cinema, right? These up and
Right.
coming
Yes.
directors who are doing interesting things are being shoehorned into these larger studio products, and sometimes they kind of let them do their thing, like we're talking about here, but like the MCU doesn't really,
Yeah.
with the exception of Black Panther, where they let Ryan Coogler like do his thing. It's like the only movie that wasn't prevised out of all like 23, and he got like a ton of leeway to do a bunch of different stuff, and it was massively successful
Yeah.
critically and commercially. Um, so I don't know. There are exceptions, but like, yeah, I think what they're talking about mostly is like we're kind of like, instead of this person making whatever they want to make next or having that kind of freedom, they're getting shoehorned into these IP machines, and it ends up feeding into this reboot remix culture that we have, which is a whole nother topic, that I don't know if that's, maybe that's like inevitably where this goes, right? Is this, any conversation about this ends up going towards
Leads
this
to
like
that.
this like spin-off reboot
Yeah.
remix.
Well, and that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when you came up with the example of Stranger Things, is like that and a few other maybe notable exceptions aside, I think for the most part the big commercial successes are at this point, it's pretty entrenched, are any entities that have some pre-existing audience. So like, why is it reboots and cinematic universes, and what all those have in common is an existing audience, and it makes sense. It's like if you it works, the marketing ploy that it is works on me. Like when
Oh yeah.
Dune is coming out, I'm like, oh, I know that book. That's awesome. Or like when Blade Runner, 2049 came out, I was like, this is I want to see another Blade Runner movie. This is great.
It's the solution to just like the overwhelming amount of choice we have.
Yes, right? Yeah, it narrows things down, and it's like, oh, I'm already invested in that, and it can be a very, as TV has shown us, being engaged in like this ongoing story and characters, and can be a very rewarding process. And I think like that's one of the things that like the MCU got right for the people who followed that whole thing, who were invested. Like that was a very like Endgame was an incredible experience to be able to see all this come to a head and
great
pay off
finale.
And yeah. So, but what I was gonna say is like, I think it's hard to tell sometimes from the perspective we have right now if cinema is really dying or if this like other beast just reared its head and is bigger and just will always be bigger than whatever cinema and like little creative indie shows, not indie, I guess shows aren't really indie, but like stuff like Fleabag and Atlanta.
They're definitely, I would say they're indie shows.
Yeah.
We just haven't heard of them.
Right. But so like are those things, you know what I'm saying? Like are those things relative to how successful like Fellini's 8.5 was, just to use that as an example since that's what Scorsese uses, in the 70s. Like I guess you could look this up and figure it out. But like commercially, are those entities actually less successful than they would have been, 20 years ago? Or is it just that like they're just never going to be as successful as these huge monolithic like cultural pieces of entertainment are?
Yeah, I don't know. Is the easy or the real answer, I guess.
Right. That's kind of a hype. I don't really think anybody knows, unless I guess you could just maybe try to crunch all the numbers and figure it out.
Hypothesis, right?
Right.
We can muse on it. One of the first TV critic that I really was into, or like got me really interested in thinking about TV as TV instead of just like movies, because I went to film school, like a nerd. But he was writing about TV and he was talking about how great it was. It's Andy Greenwald, who was writing for Grantland at the time. And he still has like a podcast, but he's like writing TV now. He's not a TV critic, quote unquote. He's not like following it like week to week. And he was saying that one of the reasons he wanted to do that was because, or reasons he wanted to change was because towards the end of being a critic, he just felt like an investment advisor, where he was like, people would come to me and be like, I have this many hours
40 hours
to devote to something. What should I invest in?
Yeah.
And like for a TV show. And he was like, maybe you should invest in this thing because everyone's watching it. Or you should invest in this thing because like it's a safe bet because I know that you're going to like Star Wars or whatever. Yeah. You like Star Wars, so The Mandalorian is a safe bet to give you, instead of being like, oh, you like Star Wars, well, you might really like The Expanse or something, which is a much bigger time commitment, but also like very different, and it's not really like Star Wars at all. But like other than that,
they both take place in space.
That's right. I was struggling to come up with a different one. But yeah, I think that from that perspective of just like the amount of, I think we're getting back to like the delivery method, right? When cinema was, you walk down the street and it's whatever the theater has playing, you get to choose from like 5 different things that are at the theater.
Yes.
Is a lot different than asking someone to open up Netflix and there's hundreds or like, I mean, literally hundreds of things that you could watch at the touch of a button. And you don't know what to watch and you need something to steer you. It's helpful when some of them are based off of like something you already know. And I mean, you and I watch enough like TV and movies to know that like it's all kind of based off of stuff we already know. Like,
yes,
there's like someone said there's only like 30 different stories or something that can be told, and everything is just kind of like a riff off of
when I heard that, I was like, that's actually pretty many. Like,
yeah, you could watch. I mean, like, think about how many coming of age stories you've seen.
Right. Yeah.
how basically every episode of the MCU is the same. It's always, in the vast majority of them, it is like, oh, I am immature. Then there's a challenge. I have to become more mature to defeat that challenge.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why I think Black Panther is really good is because it does that, but it's also like, I have an argument. Here's a counter argument. And then we come up with like a synthesis of these two arguments, and that's what we're going to go forward with.
Yeah.
And I think like the better ones do that, but most of them don't. Like,
Yeah.
there's none of that in like Iron Man. He's like, I do whatever I want, and then it's like, oh, but you can't do whatever you want. He's like, oh, well, I'll sacrifice some of that, and I'll be better, more mature. It's just the coming of age story, which makes sense. That's their target audience, is adolescent people, or Arrested Development people.
Right. There's the real tea buried 45 minutes into the episode. Jackson says that Marvel is only for adult children.
Oh, I didn't say that.
No.
That's what Mark Maron says.
Okay, yes.
A big fan of, I don't know if you've seen that interview, but he's on Conan, I think, and Conan's like, did you see, someone thought that you were in one of the Avengers movies or something, and he was like, no,
they're for kids. Yeah.
He was like, I don't like those movies, and he starts getting booed from the audience, and he's like, what are you guys complaining about? You're in charge of culture. Like, everything we do is about you guys now. It's for grown man. I think he calls them grown man children. He's like, I just want to go to a movie and go talk about it with someone afterwards and have no idea what the hell we just saw.
That's what I like. When I was making that Snyder Cut video, there was like beads of sweat forming on my brow, because I was like, I'm pretty sure this video is gonna do like well, but also like,
do I want it to do well?
Throwing a bone into the like the world that is. I
felt the same way about the MCU one. I was
people like, scrapping over like which version of the Justice League is better, is like, oh boy. Like, yeah, that's a whole side of like internet culture and film discussion that like I don't care being negative about here, because I don't want a piece of it. It's not like, it's very toxic, and it's just not great.
And I think that goes back to the same thing we were talking about again, of like how the way people like digest the way they interact with these media. Like I was writing it from not an MCU perspective, and I was pretty, in my video, I was pretty harsh on Bucky, the Winter Soldier, who goes on several murderous rampages, and they're like, but how could he ever do something? He's such a nice guy. I knew him 75 years ago. And I was like, some people have like reached out to me and been like, well, that actually Bucky was brainwashed and didn't have agency over his own actions, and actually he overcame all of that stuff in Wakanda in the end, in the stinger scene at the end of this movie. And I was like, sure, that's all there, but like, I sometimes I feel like people lose the forest for the trees when they become so in deep with these giant like cultural things.
I'll say, like, it's nothing against people who want to enjoy stuff like that in a
I'm not
in-depth nerdy way. I would say like the part of it that I think probably bothers both of us is like that often comes with a sense of like, if you aren't enjoying it in this way, you're doing it wrong somehow. Like, you're wrong because you don't know all the little pieces of lore and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's so.
That this is the correct way to watch it. And that if you're not doing it that way, it's like a less evolved way of watching it. Which is, I mean, I think it's a way, I think part of the insecurity is that these people are like, this thing used to be like, just this, we used to be part of this like comic culture where it was like kind of culty, and now it's super mainstream and tons of people are watching it, which is good. We're happy about that because that means it continues, but also like we feel the need to differentiate ourselves from the lay viewer.
Yeah. And I know what that's like. I've been into things that have like blown up, and you know, I know what it's like to have that experience of like,
Yeah,
oh,
same.
like see people what do what feels like misinterpret something, you know,
I mean, we get
because
into this conversation all the time about Lost and how,
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. I definitely used to feel like, oh, if you don't like it, you just like don't get it.
Yeah.
And oh, whatever. I mean,
But I try like the key is excuse me. The key is I try to be really careful about like judging someone's interpretation on the basis of they haven't like consumed it in the right way. Like, and people do that on the opposite side with the pretentious cinema stuff, where it's like, well, you didn't like it. You didn't like Tenant because you didn't see it in 70 millimeter IMAX. It's like that's the same. That's the same thing under a different name. So it's like it's all just gatekeeping.
I think you touched on the real reason that these superhero movies are TV, and that's because the Snyder Cut's in 4:3, which is a film,
A
an aspect
television.
ratio pioneered by
Yes,
TV.
yes.
Yeah,
I think it's ironic now that like movies were in that more rectangular uh aspect ratio, and
yeah.
then
It was like westerns were super famous for like ultra widescreen.
they did that intentionally to differentiate themselves. It was kind of like, oh no, we're losing audience to television, so they're like, what can we do differently? Oh, make it wider. So they did, and so then movies were
Yep.
really widescreen, and that set it apart from TV. And then eventually, TV became like 16 by 9. Now some TV is in like, you know, widescreen as well as 16 by 9. There's a lot more overlap, but IMAX, which is kind of like now it's like the ultimate like cinema, the biggest cinema you could possibly experience, is uh, is like 4 by 3
Yeah.
because it's this huge towering thing, and so it's like reverted in on itself. TV is no longer 4 by 3. Cinema is.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, it's all just, yeah, it's all just contrast. It's just trying
Yeah.
to differentiate the product for the sake of differentiation, not for necessarily any like I Patrick Willems did a video about Christopher Nolan doing 4:3 in like IMAX and how that
Yeah.
like made his filmmaking better, and I thought that was like a compelling argument. But I mean, for the most part, it just seems like not that. I don't know.
Yeah,
It seems like to do it.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but we probably shouldn't get into it, or we'll be here for 25 minutes just on that topic. So about your
Release the Snyder cut of this podcast.
about your MCU propaganda video, which I really enjoyed. So I think I wanted to ask you about something,
Okay.
which is I think kind of would be like the surface gut reaction of a lot of people who wanted to like defend the MCU against some of what
Okay.
you were saying, which would be this like this idea that, and I don't agree with this. I just think bringing it up
Yeah,
will
let's
lead
do
to
it.
interesting discussion. But it's like, why are you taking it so seriously? Like
Okay.
you realize, and you kind of allude to this in the video, but like it's
I think there are two reasons that I
comic
took
book
this so seriously. One is kind of like a bitty trolley answer, which is that these people are complaining about not being taken seriously enough, and then when you take them too seriously, they're like, "Why are you taking it so seriously? It's just a comic book movie." But then Martin Scorsese's like, "It's not cinema," and they're like, "How dare he?" So that's the first point. But the second point is something I feel actually is what I find so interesting about television, which is generally a lower effort ask than like the cinema that Scorsese is talking about. Like 8.5 is like a more is like a bigger audience ask of your audience than like Lucifer, an episode of
Sure.
Lucifer, a show that I am watching now,
Yeah.
which is about the devil being a cop. It's just like a procedural, right? Like every episode there's like
Yeah,
some overlapping stuff, but for the most part, it's just like same. Like every episode is
Is there a baby? Well, I guess they have Paw Patrol. Is there a baby cop show? Like
Paw Patrol is like the one. Yeah.
what iteration of cop show has not been made?
I haven't. I have the limit does not exist. I haven't found it yet.
It's
But
yeah.
but my point is that just because something is low effort doesn't mean that it's not sending you messages or that it isn't
Yes.
that you're not receiving those messages. If that were true, then then advertising wouldn't work on anybody.
Right.
Because that's like the most passive kind of like media, and yet it's like billions of dollars of industry because it is effective. Like we do tend to associate these things because we see them over and over again.
Yeah.
And a lot of times those things don't have as big of a narrative or a coherent argument as like the MCU. I watched an ad last night that was for Skittles, and like I don't know if you've seen any of these Skittles ads, but they've gotten like very surreal, and it's like a guy is in a room and he gets like punched by like he like looks in a vent and he gets punched by like a bear claw, and then it's like Skittles, and I'm like, I don't know what message that is at all.
Yeah.
That's a lot less coherent than like a guy literally dressed as an American flag fighting people, or a guy who is literally like, that's how dad did it, that's how America does it, and he's fighting Islamic terrorists.
Yeah.
I think that those things are much more clear, and yeah, I think that those are the reasons why I'm taking it so seriously, is these things are watched by so many people.
Yeah.
And they're so successful, and so often I think people aren't really thinking about I'm not saying that these are like subliminal messages, like if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, it's like kill your baby or whatever, but I do think that there are messages in these things that we aren't really thinking about and we're just absorbing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're everywhere over the MCU, and that was why I wanted to tackle that.
And I think
I wanted to troll the
right.
movie nerds. Yeah.
And I think it's important to know like the ways in which like literal propaganda is involved. It's not just like oh, someone who the person who wrote this kind of just is into the military. It's like there's
the military sponsored this movie.
Yes, yeah.
The military,
there's product placement, and the product is you joining the military. Like,
yeah, and like this was really apparent during Captain Marvel, where they trotted out Brie Larson to just be like,
yeah,
women can be military war criminals too. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but like there's this like famous ad or like it went like viral because people were just like dunking on it so hard, but it's her just like talking to Air Force pilots and just being like female Air Force pilots, and just being like, you guys are so cool and all this other stuff. And like, what does the Air Force do? It like bombs people to death. Like, I don't know. There's not like, yeah. And obviously like the military is spending millions of dollars on this, and they're bragging about it. Like there was a tweet the other day when the Oscars were announced. I guess it wasn't the other day, but like when the Oscars were announced, the Department of Defense Twitter account was like, we sponsor all of these movies. See how the American military helps get Hollywood movies made. And they're like proud of it. And it's like, no, this is like not great. And that's the same thing that we saw in early cop shows. Like that is the genesis of the cop shows genre, which is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it in the Copaganda series, even though they're not like cops. Is the original cop shows were, okay, the LAPD will give this show access to our case files. You can change the names or whatever, and like we'll make sure that it's accurate in terms of like procedure and stuff like that. Like, oh, would this really happen? And in exchange, we get to decide what stories get told. We can like scrap stuff that we think is too edgy or we don't want to talk about, and there are like topics that are just off limits.
Yeah. And
like they didn't show anything about like the LAPD being segregated until like the 60s. That was just not touched on. There was like stories that were about like botched abortions that were just scrapped because the LAPD was like, no. and I'm not saying that those are like necessarily stories that like need to be told or whatever else, but
But
like
it's
that's not the judgment I'm
it's
making.
valuable to know, like,
Yes.
regardless of what you could love the military, it's still valuable to know that, like, literally, like, literal, like, the definition of propaganda is like there are people who are involved and are portraying things in a certain way because it
From the
suits their,
state. Yeah.
yeah, from the state, because it suits their interest. And it's like, I don't know how many, like, I didn't know that about the MCU stuff. I don't know
Yeah.
how many people do. So I
They
think it's
lost, I know that they lost their like funding, or like DOD, the Department of Defense, like walked away from the first Avengers movie because they didn't like how like the military
something,
was
yeah.
being perceived. And then you see like, if you like think about it while you're watching them, you start to see like less like airplane, like F-22s or whatever, and
Right,
it's more
right.
just like amorphous space vehicles.
Yeah.
And then you get back to Captain Marvel, which I think was the first one in a while that had it. Or Winter Soldier also had it, and Civil War. But yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. There was a story from the first Iron Man movie where Robert Downey Jr., or maybe this was in the script, I don't know, but there was some quip about like Tony Stark makes some joke about like a soldier, like it's a vague allusion to suicide, like it's a joke, and I can't tell you the exact joke because I don't remember it, but it's like the reporting was that it was like pretty innocuous,
Mm-hmm.
and DOD stepped in and was like, you cannot say that because we do not want anyone mentioning suicide in reference to soldiers, because
Right,
that is an
yeah.
issue that we don't want to deal with. And that's like a minor thing, but it's like a thing that they did
Yeah,
that is
yeah,
like censorship.
yeah,
And you can be like, oh, that's good or bad or whatever, but you should know about it, I think.
yeah. I agree. I definitely agree. Yeah, no, I think, like, it's interesting watching that video. Part of why I brought this, like, topic up is like you make so many very good, valid critiques, and there's things like, when you're talking about Iron Man, and you're kind of suggesting sort of solutions. You're like, well, maybe there could have been some attention placed on sort of the I don't remember exactly what you said, but like the good
Yeah.
he's doing, or helping some of the people he's hurt or whatever. And in the back of my head, I'm like, ugh, that's a lot to ask of like a Disney movie. But then there was this other part of me that's like, no, but these films are engaging with those themes. And that, I think, is the defining
Yes.
characteristic. It's like, it'd be fine if you wanted to make, like, somebody, Spider-Man zipping around Manhattan and he's doing stuff, and if you don't want to engage with, like,
You don't have to engage with these things. No,
yeah, you
absolutely
don't.
not. Yeah.
But they're stepping into that world. They're engaging with these topics in sometimes a pretty heavy way, as you point out. And so I think because of that, it's necessary to hold it up to a higher standard,
Yeah.
A, and B, understand that it's not just some writer somewhere who's,
I mean,
portraying
there's
things.
the first
It's
Iron Man movie, like one of the first scenes, it's like the movie starts with like him getting bombed, and then it goes back to in Afghanistan, which is obviously a very strong image for Americans, especially like 2008. And then the next scene is like a flashback, and he's like talking to some reporter who's like badgering him, and the reporter's like, they call you the Merchant of Death or something, and he's like, that's what they call me, I guess. And she's like, do you ever feel bad about like being a war criminal? And he's like, nah, baby. And then he like has sex with her.
Yeah.
But in that exchange, he at one point is like, I never hear any of you guys talking about like the IntelliCrops that we make that feed the world's hungry. And that's like a throwaway line.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that like hardcore fans would be like, see, Tony Stark is doing this thing that you want him to do, but the movie isn't about that. Like they don't spend any time talking about that. Or my bigger thing is like, he doesn't do anything to like actually improve the situation for the people that his weapons hurt. Like he's like supposed to be atoning for this thing where he sold weapons and the weapons got in the wrong hands and they've ruined people's lives. innocent people's lives. And what does he do? He just like flies in and just like kills a bunch of people and flies away. And he doesn't like right that wrong. He doesn't like their village is still destroyed.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I guess it's not actively being destroyed anymore, but he still is responsible for that, and he didn't do anything. But the movie like wants to engage in that kind of like redemption story without doing the hard work. And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just saying
No.
if you bring that up, you have to like
Yeah.
actually bring it up.
Yeah. And it would be fine to make, I think it would be fine to make just something that's like, oh, this is just fun and entertaining, and you forget about it and you zone out and whatever, and it's media doesn't necessarily have to engage with like political issues or whatever. I think personally, like that's not a necessity. A lot of them, I think the thing is, a lot of them do, and then if you do, then you have a sort of responsibility to do that in an interest or like a meaningful, responsible way.
I don't think they used to, right? Like if you look at like the old Batman movies, like Batman
Right.
Forever, they don't do that. But both The Dark Knight and Iron Man both come out in 2008. They start this big superhero boom that will never end and that we're currently living through. And but they were both political movies to some extent.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people were copying that. And I think about like the first Spider-Man movie, like the Tobey Maguire one. There's no politics in that whatsoever.
No. Yeah.
And it's totally fine. Like I think that's a good movie. That's fun. And both of those movies, all three of them, I don't think are very political. But that's my like biggest problem with the new the new Marvel show, Falcon and Winter Soldier, is that they like want to bring up these ideas, but then they don't do the work of like doing it.
Yeah.
And like Civil War is this movie about oversight and checks and balances and freedom and all this other stuff, and then they're just like, whatever.
Yeah. And it's like, and I think some of that was it probably comes out of the comics. I literally don't know. I've never read a comic in my life, but some of that probably comes out of the comics, I'm guessing, where like if it's one author just like writing a series or whatever, they can explore some of these topics maybe in an interesting way. There's probably a little less oversight or something. But then it's like you blow that up to the scale of like a $1 billion company, which like each individual movie is basically.
Each one of these movies is pulling in $1 billion.
Then it's like that's not a place where you can nimbly like execute a like political discussion about something. That's not to say it can't be done or couldn't be done well. It's just
I think again, this is like something that I think there are movies in the MCU that do it well. Like Black Panther is a movie that does it well. Yeah. He's like, we should be isolationist. The other guy's like, Killmonger's like, we need to like free Black people everywhere. And then he goes like, we don't have to talk about that. But like, then they come to like this other political stance. And I think the last Thor movie kind of does that. He's like, oh, wow, we were like this really colonial nation. That's kind of weird. Let's not do that. And like, it's very simple.
Yeah.
And they don't have to go into it that much because it's like mostly about like action and like jokes and Taika Waititi. And that's fine to me. But I feel like it's troubling when you want to bring it up and then you kind of don't want to deal with it because you are sending a message when you do that too. Not bringing it up and then not talking about it is also a stance.
Is a message.
You're sending. That is a political argument too.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. It's the psychology of it is fascinating. Not just that these things are getting made, that like there's so many cop shows that but not just the fact that these things are getting made and there's sort of propaganda embedded in them in different ways, but just the fact that like some of the biggest entertainment entities for some reason were like, oh yes, stuff about our imperialistic wars, that's entertaining. It's like it's an interesting I don't know. And I'm not like putting shade on entertainment exploring deep topics, but there's something fascinating about like the broader American psyche that it's like, yes, this is what we want to go to the movie in droves to see is like,
Very
whatever,
nationalist.
yeah,
Yeah.
whatever these movies are. But I guess it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just weird because it's not something like I have thought of traditionally as uh like it's not they're not traditionally thought of as like conservative. Like Disney is not thought of as like a conservative
Yeah.
media entity.
People think of this as like different than um like the Benghazi movie, like 13 Hours that
Yes.
Michael Bay made. Like
Right.
people are like, oh yeah, that is propaganda. Like that's
And
a propaganda movie. But like
right.
they look at Iron Man and they're like, oh yeah, that's a superhero movie.
Yeah.
And
You thought.
yeah, you like you said, you think of like I think Disney really wants to present itself as like I would say liberal.
They
I
just
guess,
do
like,
Disney just does what gets Disney money. Like
exactly.
because they do the same thing.
Exactly.
They do the same thing in China. Like every now and then they run into a controversy where like they make a movie like Mulan or whatever and it's like they're just giving that country and it's in the media they're making more specifically for that exactly what it wants in terms of political messaging,
Yeah.
et cetera. And so it's like
There's this there's one of my favorite video essays from Lindsay Ellis it's called Woke Disney, and it's about how Disney is so much more willing to address like feminism and stuff because that is so much of an easier sell than dealing with any of like the racist stuff that they have. So like every time they remake these movies in like the live action, like Beauty and the Beast, they live action it, and they try to like graft this like girl boss story onto it because that sells. They know that sells, but it's harder. It's a tougher sell to deal with like the racist crows from Dumbo. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yeah, there. I mean what David Simon would say is that capitalism is just going to take whatever the drive, or I guess David Simon wouldn't say this, but like there are definitely a lot of Marxist theorists, media theorists who would say the thing that makes capitalism so powerful is that it ends up co-opting all of these progressive messages. So like imperialism, like anti-imperialism can become just as big a selling point as, and serving that imperialist thing. Like girl bosses can be imperialist too with Captain Marvel or any of that stuff. Or
I think you even
Che Guevara t-shirts. That's not Disney, but like it's the same concept, right?
Yeah.
Like he was like a socialist, and they're like, well, let's make money off of his image.
Good times. What a fun world we live in.
It's great. Yeah.
That's why we talk about TV and movies.
and
to distract ourselves from the bizarre land.
I mean, my channel's becoming less distraction.
It's true. It's true. Things. It is true. You're waking people up. No, it's good.
It's mostly I just can't sleep.
I'm talking about you're over here making hour-long diatribes about militaristic propaganda in the Marvel movies, and I'm like, the Snyder Cut is better than the other one.
I really enjoyed that video. So your video, not mine. I didn't enjoy making mine at all.
Oh man.
Yeah, cool.
Well, that was good. That was a good discussion.
Yeah.
I don't think I have anything else. Should we leave people with anything? Do you have any kind of recommendations?
I mean, the thing that my crusade now is people to know that the MCU is a TV series. So as long as people have gotten that out of this, I feel confident.
As a TV series, would you recommend the MCU?
Like as a time investment? Like as an
sure,
investment?
Yeah. You are the television's financial advisor.
Yeah, I think so. I think people, first of all, you get tons of people to talk to about it.
Yes.
Like everybody has things to say about it. We just talked about it for like an hour and a half. So there's that. Two, it's never gonna end. So there's always gonna be more content if you want. And if you don't want to watch it, you can always stop. and it's generally like, I don't know, it's never worse than like a C plus. It's never
Yeah.
like that great, but it's never terrible, in my opinion. Sometimes it's good.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
High
used to-
median, or high average, I would say.
Right. I used to like hate them. I was like, oh, I hate these movies. And then I was like, I realized I was just taking them too seriously and trying to like I wanted them to be something they weren't. And then
You wanted them to be cinema.
I wanted them to be cinema. And so every time I would watch, I'd be like, oh, it's not cinema. But then at a certain point, I was just like, well, if I don't like them, I can just not watch them. So that helped. But then also I was like, well, if I am going to watch one, I'm not going to expect it to be something that it isn't. And since I adopted that mindset,
My favorite time to catch up on MCU movies is on flights.
oh yeah, they're a great airplane movie,
Which is
great airplane
hilarious
movie.
because they like spend so much time on these like visuals, these like,
Yeah, and then you're watching it,
and I'm
all
like, great, awesome. This is where I want to watch it, on my phone. Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. The MCU is a television series, and it's a decent TV series.
I mean, there's a TV series I would recommend over it. For
Oh
sure.
yeah. It wouldn't make it into my top 10
No.
TV wise, but it ranks higher on my list of TV than it does movies, probably.
That's fair. Yeah. It's like number 6 on your list of TV shows after the first 5 seasons of The Wire, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The only 5 seasons. I don't know why I said first 5.
We don't talk about that 6th season.
People don't want to talk about the 5th season, but I like the
No.
5th season.
Yeah, the 5th season's underrated. We'll get to that though in a future.
Someday.
Someday we'll record a 4-hour episode and
Spend 45 minutes on each season.
Yeah. All about the Wire.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, thanks, Jackson, and
yeah, thanks for having me.
we'll talk again sometime soon.